when I started the nursery, I guess I won't continue. There were no people propagating plants, and there was very little information. So what I'm going to share with you today is stuff that a lot of it has come out, since most of us started nurseries. These are some friends from Sunlight Gardens, Andy Sessions and Marty Zinni. They also just recently retired, but themselves, myself, and one other nursery, Niche Gardens in North Carolina, they were pretty much it for propagating nurseries. We all started about the same time. So just that's a little history, is that this information used to not be available. So one thing I want to encourage you guys is to naturalize areas that you have that, you might have a little extra room for, because we all know that, adding more species is what we want to do. And naturalizing is propagating, but it's pretty simple stuff. Like on the left-hand side here is a meadow that it's a pollinator meadow that we did here at Foothills Land Conservancy. And it started last year, and it was pretty simple, and it's doing very well. So that's one way. And on the right-hand side is just an area that used to be a vegetable garden at my place, and some things got started there, and I just managed it such that they were encouraged. I didn't mow it while they were blooming. I let them all go to seed. I weed eat around things. I might throw some other seed in there. So, I just want to encourage you to think about, if you've got a little bit of property, or even if you work with somebody else, think about areas that you might not have to mow, and that you might be able to do some of these techniques that we'll be talking about in a little bit. For example, this is a spring shot of some blue-eyed Mary here on the left side, and phlox as a ground cover, and the red buckeye. All these have naturalized. I started them at the nursery, but they have spread, and it's mostly from me letting them go to seed, or taking the seed and throwing it out somewhere, not potting something up and planting it in the ground, just letting these things do their own thing in a place where they can. This phlox, woodland phlox, works really well for spreading on its own. So, and there's a lot of things like this. So a lot of people tend to want to control things a little too much, and they want to weed eat after it flowers and things like that. So I just want to encourage you to think about letting things run their course, and let the good things seed in. And you might want to edit out the bad things, but we can naturalize a lot of areas without having to grow something in a pot and plant it and go to all that trouble and expense. So just think about naturalizing areas if you can. For example, on the left here, I had blue lobelia on the left side of the sidewalk, and it decided to seed in all along the right-hand side this year. And it had never done that before. And I just didn't weed eat it or mow it down. So now I have a nice border of blue lobelia that I didn't do anything. On the right-hand side is a wet depression that's on the property. And for years, I used to throw seed from the nursery, extra seed, in places I thought it might grow well. I threw some of this rose mallow out years ago, and now it's a solid stand in there in the dry season. So those are kind of things just think about if you've got areas on your property, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. So think about where you can just kind of casually get some good native plants started. This is just a quick fun thing. You may have seen this in places, but it's a fun thing. I'm going to say maybe with kids or some other public project you might have in mind, but you just basically mix seed in with some clay and manure, and there's a whole recipe for this, but you put the seed in there, and then you've got this dry ball, and you can just take and toss it out somewhere. And so presumably when it rains, you've got it ready to plant. It's got fertilizer and everything else in there. So that's just a fun thing it might be something good to do with kids, but just an aside. All right, so let's get into some propagation. And again, this is propagation 101. So I'm not going to give you a whole lot of details. At the end, I've got some resources, and I highly recommend that you go to those for details. I'm just going to try to give you the principles of how to collect seed and clean seed and grow stuff from seed primarily, so that you can begin to do this on your own. It's really not very complicated, and a lot of times you can't find these plants somewhere else, so you want to grow them yourself. So the simple beginning is, if the seed is dry when it's collected, like many of the summer flowering things we got going on right now, those seed heads are dry, that's considered dry seed. Pretty simple. If it's a berry or a lot of the spring things that have an eliosome, and I'll show you that later, those are considered moist seeds. So that's the first division you want to make, is figure out if you got a dry seed or a wet seed. Some ethics of collecting seed that most of you guys probably know, but you can only collect on your own property or with permission on somebody else's property. You don't ever want to collect all of anything, and you rarely need more than a handful of anything for your own personal use. So just don't collect willy-nilly. Just get a little bit for what you need, and never collect rare species. For the most part, for our personal gardens, you don't need to do that. Most of the time, they're pretty tricky anyway, and you might just be wasting the seed. So I'm just gonna say don't collect rare species seed. Back in the day, we didn't have sources for some of these seeds, and we wanted some local sources. So these might be some people, you know, Pat Carr on the left from ORNL, on the top's Wes James from TVA. On the bottom left is Linda Mann from ORNL, and the right's Nancy Dagley from TVA. So we were doing projects, and we needed native grass seed in particular. And so we found native stands, and this is how we collected, mostly just by hand. That thing that Wes had, well, that was a fun thing to use, but it didn't work that great. So anyway, this, you know, we do a lot still by collecting by hand. So this is the same thing I'm going to show you how to do. So the first trick that is going to become an issue for you is identifying the seed head when the flowers are gone. Now, you guys are pretty good botanists, I know, but a lot of people aren't. And once the flower's gone, it can be pretty tricky sometimes to know to go back and collect seed that you're sure that you've got the right thing. So it's fun to learn that. So, but that's the first thing you got to overcome, is make sure you're able to collect what you want to collect. And that just takes experience. Then you want to know if it's ripe. In this example, you've got wild indigo on the left, and you can see it's getting ripe from the bottom to the top, which is very common. A lot of things flower from the bottom to top. The ones at the top, I'm going to say, are nowhere near ripe enough to collect. And the ones on the bottom, I thought might be, but I opened this one and they're still green. You know, they might go ahead and get ripe. But what you generally want to look for is, you can peek into seeds. And let me see if I have, yeah, here's just a zinnia, because that's what I had. You can actually open a seed head without even taking it off the plant and look in there and see what color the seed is. If it's really light colored and green or white, it's not ripe. The ones on the right, you can see down here, the dark end of this is the seed. And if you're still not sure, you can take like a knife or clippers just to be sure that there's actually seed in there, and clip into your seed to see if there's live seed in there. And you might need to do several just to know, but learning to identify if it's ripe and then knowing what that seed is. Some things it's a little tricky once you get into the seed. There's all kinds of these plant parts in there, and you may not be sure what the seed is. So again, that just takes some experience, but you can peek into these seed heads and get an idea of what's going on. For example, also Columbine looks very different when it's going to seed. Usually it's easy to identify because you've got the foliage, but you can see here that some of these are not ripe yet, and some have already browned off, and here's what's inside is lots of little small black seeds. Great thing for columbine is it holds those seeds for a good long time. So you've got a pretty good opportunity to not lose those seeds if you're keeping an eye out. And one thing about columbine, it needs light to germinate. That's why it's pretty easy to just scatter out. You don't need to dig a hole and plant it. One of my favorites for naturalizing is this lyre-leaf sage, and it makes a lot of seed. This is at my home, and I have just let the seeds go to seed for years and let it spread. When the seed is done, I mow it down, and it looks like this shot on the right-hand side. It's a great little ground cover, and you can just take handfuls of the seed heads and toss them around, and you'll probably get more plants. And you might have to work with some other species that are growing into it, but it doesn't take much effort. It'll tend to cover the ground. But for collecting seed, like for the sage, you want to check on it every now and then and go look and see when it starts to get brown. So in this case, you can see up here at the top, these were collected on the same plant, and one is starting to get ripe. The other is pretty well already ripe and dark. Once they start to turn a little bit tan, they're probably going to go ahead and get ripe. Now, in this case, I collect, you can't just collect these individuals. They're too small. And so you just collect the whole stalk. Some might not be ripe, but you'll get enough. And again, it doesn't take too much. Next thing excuse me. Next thing you want to do is these are dry seeds, and they need to dry out the whole stalk and everything before you can get all the seed out. So I put them in buckets or pots, or you could put them out on some newspaper, usually for a week or two, and oftentimes you can just shake and most of the seed will come out. So you should be able to tell and look like in the bottom of your bucket or whatever to see if you've got the seed. So that's the general way to collect dry seed. Now, you probably don't need screens for your personal use, but they're handy. There's a lot of chaff with seed, and if you think you're going to be doing quite a bit of this for some reason, you might want to get some seeds, and you can buy these, just the plain screens that you can make, like the ones on the left. You can buy those online, or the ones on the right, I think you can still get them at biological supply houses, but they're pricey. So again, you don't really need that. You can just clean stuff with your hands and do just fine. Some seed is a little hard to get loose from the seed heads. And this is an example of beard tongue, and using pretty much like this is a piece of pipe, but it's like a rolling pin, and you just, not too hard. You don't want to crush the seed, but you just roll over that seed head and crack those things open. And you can see up here on the right that most of them have come open and the seed is out, and down here on the bottom, there's plenty of seed. So that's one thing you might have to do with some seeds, just to get the seed out. Moist berries. So they're obvious. They have a fleshy outside. Most of your spring things are considered moist. Many of the woody plants and shrubs have berries, and you need to clean that off. Normally, an animal's going to eat that and digest it, and the acids and stuff in there are going to break it down and get it ready for sowing, or for planting the next year coming up, excuse me. So for us, we just need to take off all this flesh. There's multiple ways to do it. But as you can see here, really all I did was take a few of these seed heads and put them in a kitchen strainer and just rub that for a while. And it doesn't take long. Now, one thing about especially these spring things, this white tissue here is called an eliosome or an aril, and it's very nutritious. A lot of insects like ants and wasps and yellow jackets will often take these and and eat that elaiosome and then just leave the seed. They don't eat the seed. So it's just a dispersal mechanism for the plant. So it works real well. But for us, we need to take that off. And there's some other ways to do it I'm not going to get into, but for home use, it's pretty easy to just kind of rub those things off. But just know that you need to clean that seed. And here's just a bunch of berries that recently we were collecting. And another way, like if you have a fair number of seeds, you can use one of these stick blenders, but with like a round blade on it, that not one of those sharp blades that'll break the seed, but just sort of like a cheese grater type blade. And it just takes a little pulsing, and it actually takes it does a pretty good job of cleaning a bigger lot of seed that you might want to try. Drink of water, excuse me. Dormancies and storage. Now this is the part that you may be unfamiliar with, and a lot of people wonder, they sow seed and it doesn't come up, and it's not too complicated, but there are a few tricks. After you have cleaned your seed, like say the dry seed, you're going to want to store that in a cool place. Definitely not on the dashboard of your car, like when you're driving home from collecting it. So anytime you've got seed and you have the opportunity and you have to hold it for a while, you want it to be stored moist. I mean, stored cool. You never want to use the freezer. In this case, this is some butterfly weed that's not been cleaned, and I just stuck it in the refrigerator. I used to have an entire refrigerator for seed when I had the nursery, but I don't have that anymore. Okay, common germination inhibitors, basically dormancies. These are ways that the seed is able to not sprout at the wrong time. I mean, if that seed is ripe, like now in the middle of July, and it were to fall and maybe sprout in August, it probably wouldn't have time to get big enough to survive. And especially things that get ripe later in the season. So a hard seed coat is just what it says. The coat on the outside of the seed doesn't allow water in. And then you can also have chemical inhibitors that basically do the same thing. They don't allow the seed to germinate. Some things, as I mentioned, need light to germinate. Some things just aren't mature enough until the spring comes along, the next season. So those are the main things we have to overcome, but you'll see that it's not too hard to overcome those. And that's just Twyla. She wanted to say hi. Here's your two terms, one in particular that is really the main trick that's going to solve most of these problems. Stratification and scarification. Now, stratification is just a cold, moist period for 30 to 90 days. Usually 90 days is what I recommend if you don't know that it's less. And this is just you're faking winter on these seeds. So the term came from when nurserymen figured this out, and they used to take in big crates and layer sand and seed, tree seed and sand and seed, so it was stratified. So that's where the term comes from. But what we do now, the easiest thing I do, any container, but a Ziploc bag works really well with your seed that's been cleaned, and you put it with a little bit of moist soil, or I use vermiculite, but really any you can even put it in some moist paper towels, but not wet, just moist. And what you have to think about, like for example, you have dry seed. Say you have a black-eyed Susan you get in the summertime, you don't really want to sow that until next spring. And so you kind of just want to back up from when you want to sow it 90 days to say February or January. And that's when you stratify it. So you would store that black-eyed Susan seed from summer until January. You'd store it dry. and then you would stratify it cold moist for 90 days. And it's really pretty simple, but it's really just a cold moist period. Scarification is a scarring of the seed, and that's when, if you have the hard seed coats, if you can break through that hard seed coat, that seed will then sprout whenever. You don't have to do any more stratification, but stratification will also soften that seed coat. And it will also usually break down any chemical inhibitors. So stratification usually solves all these problems. And that's why that's the one thing most native plants, if you stratify them for X amount of time, you'll probably have pretty good success. On the left here, you can see this is just a file. I mean, if you just needed a few seed of something and you wanted it to sprout right away, you could just scratch through that with a file and not hurt the interior seed. And this is the Amsonia. We just clip the very tip off of that, and then the water can get in. So again, stratification is the real trick to growing most native plants. If you get that down, you'll be doing pretty well. Sowing options. These first three I consider naturalizing, but they're very effective in the right situation. Just tossing stuff out on the ground, bare ground or an appropriate place. And that's pretty much what nature does. Or you can spread hay if you cut stalks of something or something was mowed, and you can just take that and spread that out in a new area. Again, that's more or less what nature does, and you'll get, in most cases, you'll get some results. Whatever you put out there, you'll eventually get some of those plants. You can just scratch some seed into a little piece of bare ground. And that's a very simple way to do stuff. And I do that a little bit around the nursery. I find some seed. I don't need it for anything else. I see a bare piece of ground. I drop some seed in there. It usually, at least I feel like I have helped that bare piece of ground, and usually it works. You can sow in a ground bed, which would be a prepared bed that hopefully is weed free, and you probably would have sterile potting soil at least mixed in with your ground soil. That works for some things. When you don't have sterile conditions, you can lose a lot of plants, but there's certain things that would work pretty well for. And like that meadow I showed you, that's basically how that works. You're just sowing right into the ground. Propagation beds are I'll show you this in a second, but they're one of the things that I highly recommend, especially for spring ephemerals, because those take a while to mature, and these beds work well. You can also sow in containers. And on the bottom here this is a propagation bed, bottom right. On the left, this is at Overhill Nursery. These are just seed flats, and you can get these, if you've got a garden store somewhere, you can probably get these somewhere, or used ones. If you use used material, just make sure you clean them and maybe sterilize them a little bit with bleach or something. So these are all ways that you can sow this seed that you now have. This is the easiest way, and this is a way, I'm going to say, in a natural situation that you want to spread some things around. This is a totally easy way to do it. You collect the seed today, and you walk down the road and scratch it in somewhere where you want it to be. So totally easy. This is just like some aster seed. You sow it, cover it up a little bit, tamp it down, maybe throw a little bit of mulch on it, and go away. Now you don't want to do this again at the wrong time of year. You don't want it to sprout in September, but assuming you are wise enough to do it at the right time where it might survive winter, through the winter and into early spring works really well. So that's totally easy. It doesn't take any time. And if you're trying to just add a few little things to some little, back corner of your place, this might be perfect for you. The propagation beds. Now this is what North Carolina Botanic Gardens taught us, and it has been one of the best things that that I had for the nursery, and most nurseries doing native plants use these. All it is a frame, and in this case it's a wood frame, but you can do, use your imagination. Concrete blocks work just as well. What you have to watch out for in this case, there is, you can't really see it well, but there's hardware cloth stapled to the bottom of this frame, and underneath that is weed barrier or nursery cloth, this black stuff. You don't want voles and things digging up from the bottom, and you want to avoid as much as possible tree roots coming up. They will eventually come through this cloth, and that's why on this list, some people nowadays put 4 to 6 inches of gravel underneath their beds. I've never done that, so just depends on how much effort you want to put into it, but this works really well. This bed over here on the right is bluebells, and you can see it's been there over 30 years, and it's now not got much soil, but the bluebells just keep propagating themselves. But what you do here, when you have, and we'll talk about, I've got some species to talk about in a minute, but if you've got some woodland species like, say, Trillium, you can clean that seed as soon as you collect it. And if you've got one of these beds ready, you just go right out there and you just sow it. And all the stratification and everything else is taken care of because it's outside and it'll go through the seasons. So if you're interested in particularly woodland species, or I'm going to say some shrubby species, this works real well. You can do the same thing in the sun, but most sun perennials are going to grow really fast, and they'll fill this up. But if you're able to get them out of there, you can do pretty well. Here's a bed, just another way it was done. Overhill Gardens, he's just got logs on either side and filled it with sterile potting soil. And this is at Grow Wild Nursery, and here on the right is similar to the one I showed you, just a frame with soil in it. Now these over here on the left, we'll talk about this in a minute, but once you start growing plants, you're going to probably have to overwinter some in containers. And this works very well. These just to put your containers in here for overwinter. We'll talk about that in a minute. So these propagation beds work real well. Sowing in containers, and most of you, this might be the best alternative. If you only want to grow a few plants, you might just need a few pots, or a few flats. You don't need a whole big nursery of stuff. So one of the good things about sowing in pots is if you sow one species in several different pots, if you should happen to lose those through no fault of your own, but animals get in there and disease gets in there, you might not lose them all. So if you have one flat of seedlings and something happens, it's probably going to happen to the whole flat. So that's one good advantage to sowing in containers. But there's all kinds of containers, and drainage is the main issue you're going to have to deal with. I just recommend adding drainage until you've got the experience to know how they're going to drain, because stuff will rot if you don't get the drainage right. So now that you're so successful and you've got all these seedlings, and believe me, you will be successful and you will have a lot of seedlings, you're going to find yourself wanting to transplant them, not necessarily into the garden. So you might want to be prepared to plant them up for, sometimes you want to plant them up. If you sow them this spring, you want to plant them up probably sometime in the summer so that they get established into that container And then that container can be overwintered so that then they'd be ready to plant the following year. Now you could also plant them in the ground. So you've got options, but should you choose containers, you're probably going to have to overwinter them. So give them time to get rooted before winter comes. One of the main things to be concerned about is the temperature of the root zone. If it gets below about 18 degrees, your plants may be killed. Usually if you put things in a cold frame, like I showed, and I've got some more pictures, and if you do some protection over the top of them, could be just leaves. But you just be aware that you're going to need to protect your containers over winter. And I'll show you that in a minute. And again, drainage over winter, because those things are sitting there not growing and they don't want to be in a swamp. They'll rot. So here's a easy examples. And again, you can just do a frame with boards, with concrete blocks, you know, something you got handy. North side of the house is usually, or a building is usually a good spot because the temperature doesn't fluctuate so much. But you want to put these containers close together, and you want to put them on the ground, because that's going to moderate their temperature and not allow the air to blow around them and have them get colder. So just put the containers as close together as you can and put them on the ground. You want to protect them from rodents and cats, and these flats tend to look to some felines like litter boxes, just saying. So you want to be careful with leaving empty flats of what look like dirt for the cats out there. So you want to protect your seed over winter. This cloth is called nursery fabric. It's a little insulating cloth. You can probably get that nowadays just about anywhere. And that's a real handy thing to, once you've put your stuff up for winter, you can just cover it with that, and those things will usually be in pretty good shape. So anyway, think about it. You can do all kinds of creative ways, but just know that you're going to have to overwinter your containers. Okay, that's the propagation part. I'm going to run through. I don't even have, I think time is not an issue anymore. So so I've got some plants that I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about, and then we'll be done. I'm going to start in the spring. Blue-eyed Mary is Collinsia verna is a winter annual. It actually blooms in the spring, sets seed in the spring, and then that seed sprouts in the fall. And so you've got seedlings over winter. Same thing with Phacelia. And these things are really, they seed themselves in, but if you want to gather seed, it's very easy to gather the seed just as it's getting ripe. You can just pull up the whole plants because the plant's going to die, and you can take that whole plant and just throw it somewhere, and you'll probably get more seed. Now you can also clean it and go through all that, but it's a real easy one for naturalizing, both of those. Now that propagation bed I mentioned, all these spring ephemerals, this is where this would be a good place to start them. Bluebells, bloodroot, hepatica, and celandine poppy, they all have an eliosome or an arrow. And if you look into that seed pod, you'll easily see that arrow, and I'll show you that in a minute. Bluebells don't look like they have an arrow, but they do. So it's just a little trick with them. They look like they're a dry seed, but you have to treat them as if they have an arrow. So again, all these would be candidates for that propagation bed. Trilliums are just the best example I have for these arrows. This is what the arrow looks like, this white tissue. It's the eliosome or arrow. This is what the ants and critters eat. And, you know, it's a dispersal mechanism. That's why, you know, these trilliums don't tend to move too far too fast, because they're just dependent on ants. Now these seed are not ripe. I just had to collect them to show you, but they would be a little bit darker and tanner and start to get darker as they ripen. but these are ripe with trilliums. You can see the seed head here will start to soften when they're really ripe. I just want to encourage you a little bit and introduce you to a couple of people. This guy on the right is Craig Voris. I don't know if anybody knows him. You probably don't, because he's pretty much on his own. He came to one of my propagation workshops, 35 years ago, and he's a finished carpenter. That's his profession. And like 6 or 7 years later, he came back and he had trilliums, asking me if I wanted to buy him. And I was very suspicious. And then he told me, he said, well, you told me how to grow these. And so he has been growing trilliums and has done just a tremendous job for the last 25 years or so, and has figured out a whole lot about how to produce them in containers. And he's been selling wholesale for quite some time. So, I mean, he's just an everyday guy like the rest of us. And so he just decided to take this on, and he's now basically famous for what he's doing. And he's now passing the torch on to Avi over here, which you probably know Avi from Overhill Gardens. He's training Avi to grow trilliums. But anyway, you can all learn how to do this stuff. I don't have too many trees, but buckeyes are a nice, easy one to start with. They have these beautiful seeds. They're easy to collect, but they need to stay moist. You need to sow them right away, either in a pot or in the ground. And yes, the squirrels and other things might like to have those. So you'll probably find you need to protect them, especially if it's in a pot. But usually there's plenty of seed. The red buckeye has a taproot, and so it wants to be in the ground as soon as possible. It doesn't stay in a pot real long. But they're easy to collect seed, and you can just plop them in the ground, and you'll probably end up with some seed, with some plants. Fire pinks are kind of fun. They when the seed head starts to ripen, it starts to hang down, and then it opens up and the seed falls out. So you kind of got to be there, and usually you have to go back a few times to check and make sure that you've got some seed in that capsule. So it's kind of fun, but it's an easy one. Just stratify and sow it out in the spring. Blue star, there's several species that we use in our gardens. This is Arkansas blue star. It's just got these cool these are the seed heads here. The seed is just stacked in here with these little kind of like pencil lead things. And it has a hard seed coat, which, works to stratify, it works, but you can also clip the end off just to let water come in there. So those are pretty easy from seed. Beard tongues, there's many that are really nice for the garden, but a lot of them you can't necessarily find in the nursery. So this might be a candidate for you to collect on your own. And I showed you the seed heads before. They tend to hold the seed for a good long time. So you can usually find those well after they've bloomed. Trick with them though is if you have multiple ones in the garden, they tend to hybridize. So if you're trying to keep one species pure, you probably don't want to mix them up. These legumes are pretty easy. The indigos and the Carolina bush pea, their seed is already starting to get ripe for me now. And as I mentioned, it has a hard seed coat, but you can just stratify it and that works fine. Or you can, if you want it to come up a little sooner, you can scarify it. Here's a couple of good ones for naturalizing. The garden phlox and the brown-eyed Susan. Garden phlox and pretty much any of the native phloxes, they will naturalize by seed real well. You can collect the seed and you can stratify it, and that works fine too. But usually if you get a start and just let them go to seed, they will start to spread. This brown-eyed Susan, I love it to death, but it's, as they say, it will get away from you. It likes an average moist garden, not too dry, but it naturalizes it. It seeds in prolifically. Now, I've got places where I like it to do that, and I love it. It's just about starting right now. It's just full of these flowers for, gosh, probably 6 weeks. So, you know, if you've got an area that this works, it's an excellent plant. And again, you can just take armloads of the old plants and throw them out somewhere. And you definitely don't need to grow this in a pot. Just take seed and throw it out somewhere. So these are good for naturalizing. Coneflowers and black-eyed Susans, both of these are very easy to propagate from seed. One of the tricks with these and some things like them is the seed is really tight in that seed head. And until, if you leave it there and you know, don't collect it, it will start to loosen up over time. So don't get too eager if you can help it to collect those, because if you try to clean that, it's very hard. You have to use your hands to just break those seed heads up, and it will hurt your hands. You'll have to use gloves. So the thing you want to do is try to let those mature out in the garden for a while. Don't get too eager. One of the things to think about is the hybridization. Here's our famous beloved Tennessee coneflower and our beloved Mac Pritchard, who passed away this year, and we miss him. But here's, if you grow any of the coneflowers together, your seed is not seed is not going to be pure. So if you can just be careful, especially with something like a coneflower that's rare, or any plants that are rare, they might hybridize. But that's our coneflower. Butterfly weed and the milkweeds are pretty easy to grow. You just have to make sure you don't wait until that fluffy seed head opens and fluffs out, because it'll be gone. You just have to collect it a little bit early. Now, the butterfly weed has a taproot. And so as far as where you put it in a container or whatever, you have to keep in mind that it likes really good drainage, and it's going to have a taproot. So it's going to need kind of a deep pot. It's a little bit tricky because of that. They have a tendency to rot. But sowing it in the ground works pretty well too. But they're pretty easy to grow. And there's some of our milkweed friends. Bergamots and bee balms are very easy from seed. We usually do them from division, but the seed stays on there a long time, so it might be something that you might want to collect. Again, you get hybrids, and in this case, the hybrid on the right does not produce any seed. So when you're collecting seed, just remember, you know, look inside that capsule or whatever. Make sure you've got seed before you go thinking you've got something and months later you don't have anything. So be sure to peek in and make sure you've got seed. Mountain Mint's about the same as the Meridith, but the cool thing about it is those seed are there until next spring. So you've got like all year long, just about, you know, all winter long to collect seed of Mountain Mint. And I love Mountain Mint. It's looking gorgeous right now, and it lasts a really long time, and it's a heck of a pollinator plant. So that's a really nice one and easy to grow. All of the composites in the summer, I'm just kind of lumping these together just to let you know they have plenty of seed and they're easy to grow from seed. They're maybe a little bit tricky to identify, but that's one of the things you're going to learn. But all these are easy, like just stratify and sow them out the next year. And same here, these all the fall asters, goldenrods, they're all pretty easy. Now, some of these asters and goldenrods, they actually don't have a whole lot of viable seed in any one head. So you might want to collect a little more than you think you need. Native grasses are a favorite of mine, but they're super easy to collect in the fall. And usually if you find some, you find plenty. And getting your local ecotype is something that for all of these plants is important. So it might be something that you decide you want to have. This is Chris Johnson with Park Service. This was when they were just doing Cades Cove, and we collected some seed from plants that were native there, and they've now got it spread, you know, all over Cades Cove. And this is David Whitehead from TWRA, who's now retired, but he helped me get started by finding some local ecotype sources. There's all of the woody plants, which this is just an example. Just remember that the birds eat these things, and that goes for all these other seeds too, but they might be gone if you don't get them when you see them. So, but they just take a stratifying, and you might put them in those propagation beds. And that's it, boys and girls. You've got a lot of work to do, and I hope you keep growing. There's some references here at the end, which will be available to you. And that's it.
Meredith, can you hear me?
Yeah.
We have one question. And the question was, it was about transplanting and overwintering. Once in pots, could the pots be buried into raised beds that I use for vegetables for overwintering in second winter?
I'm going to say probably so. You know, the main thing you're trying to do is keep them from freezing. And you want to, the only other issue would be some kind of, you know, voles or rodents or something, but obviously if it works for your other stuff, it probably works.
And one other question, is there a frog fruit I can use instead of grass?
I don't know what that is.
Frog fruit?
Oh, violet. Is that okay? Instead of
Grass.
I'd say it would just depend on your situation. They're violets for everything. Is that what? It's phyla. Oh, phyla. I thought she said violet. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know about the frog. I have no experience with that. So sorry, can't answer that.
Okay.
There are a lot of things you can do instead of grasses, but I'm not familiar with that one.